Welcome to Simply Sarah. I'm Sarah Stockham, your host. And every week that we get together with fresh content, we interview somebody who has an interesting story, who shares a little bit about some of the challenging places and then how they got through that. Today is going to be incredibly special. We want to first say thank you to our sponsors, to Michelle Bell Art, and also to the Stegner family. But we want to bring Mr. Bill Ridgeway in, who is part of the very, very first paramedic group. They weren't even called paramedics. Mr. Bill, it is a delight to have you here with us and would love to have you share your story of how you got into that group. And I'd love for you to go all the way back because your childhood is part of the reason why you did so many different things in your life.
Yes, I did. I had a very interesting life. I was born on December 7th, 1941, in the morning when the Japanese were bombing Pearl Harbor. And so, probably when I was about 3, I think my parents got divorced, and she wasn't a very good mother. She didn't take care of my brother and I. And so we had grandmothers taking care of us. And then when my mother's grandmother passed away, they put us in military school, which wasn't much fun.
Yeah.
And then they sent us and my mother to Oklahoma so my dad's mother could raise us, our other grandmother. And what was interesting, she grew up during the, hang on,
During the
during
Depression?
during the recession, and as a sharecropper's daughter in Tennessee, Arkansas. Was from Tennessee, and she raised us with this tough love and a lot of care. But my mother couldn't handle Oklahoma, being from California, so one day she came over to my grandmother's house and asked her if she could watch me, and she'd be back, in a few hours. And she left me there and took my brother and got on a train, went back to California, and left me. And my grandmother raised me from about, I would say, close to the first grade. And anyhow, it was interesting. I was a little bit on the screwed up side, I'm sure. And I ran away, and they found me under a bridge by a creek, and just so going on. But what was really neat is she had a nephew and his wife. They just got married, and they would always take me to her farm every weekend, and so that was really nice. And then in the third grade, they moved to Tennessee, and I went to the third and the half of the fourth, and then they moved back to California for the fourth and fifth, sixth, and then we moved back to Oklahoma seventh and eighth, then back to California eighth and ninth, and that's kind of where my life started to change because when I was in Oklahoma, I started playing football, and I really kind of liked football, and I got into sports, and it sort of changed my life, and then I got into a Y club, which really changed my life, and all of us ended up being pretty successful. But then I realized I went on a vacation in the ninth grade and never really been on a vacation. And I said, well, this is kind of neat. And then I started figuring out, well, what do you got to do to have vacations like that? And I realized you needed an education. And so wasn't I didn't think I was very smart, and so I did the best I could, and I did get some good grades, especially in drafting. And I got really good at drafting. And anyhow, I got accepted at Long Beach State and studied industrial design. It was a new program that was coming out at Long Beach State, and it was in the art department at the time. And from that, I ended up getting a job at North American Aviation, and it was really interesting. And we were were allowed to work 1:30 in the afternoon till 10 at night.
Mm.
And we went to school from 8 to noon. And it was really kind of neat because then you were assigned to an engineer and you were like his gopher. So we would go to the labs and follow up on research, and then they would design stuff and we would do the drawings and for him. And if we finished it before our time, we were supposed to go home at 10, then you could do your homework, kind of a thing. And I was really good at printing, and back then they did flip charts
Yes.
for all their meetings, and so I was writing these all this stuff, like a 3-inch printing, So anyhow, we would do things like that. And one of the great stories of working there, my engineer called me up to his office and said, I want you to drive down to Seal Beach. And they had a big giant building there. And inside that building, it was like maybe 10 stories high,
Mm-hmm.
was the Saturn rocket. And on top of it was the Apollo. And he said, I want you to go up there and sit in all 3 seats. And I says, me? You want me to go
Sit.
there? And he said, yeah. And I said, just make sure that you can see this gauge from all 3 seats. And I was so nervous, and you had to go through and get scrubbed up and put a white suit on, a little white hat. And you got all the way up to the top as I'm going up, and I'm saying, I could just picture the astronaut says, who is this blankety blank that put this gauge here? So I was so nervous. Well, I must have sat in the seats 9 times going back and forth, and I was holding my hands like I had a helmet on and this, and trying to make sure if I could just glance up, if I could see it. And finally I could see it. And so I went back and told my engineer what I did, and he laughed and thought it was so funny that I, did that. And he said, well, go to the vault. And this was all done by pencil back then, no computers. And you get 26 drawings that had this gauge in it, from perspectives to whatever. And so I changed all of it. And then the other thing that I got to do, one day I came in and there was a note on my desk and 3 drawers, and all this equipment like a sextant and different items. And I had to get all of this in 3 drawers with a foam cushion with the finger grips, because you could push it in. If you open the drawer, they didn't want all the instruments to float. So I did that, and it just did it for 4 years, I believe. And then in 1964, I I got drafted in between semesters, and I didn't think that was very fair. So I went to the draft board where I grew up and said that I didn't think it was very fair. And they said, well, why don't you think it's very fair? And I says, well, it was between semesters, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and they said, you know, we think you're right. And so they said, and this was right during um, registration, basically. And they said, well, come back here ASAP that you're in school. And I happened to know, I used to work in registration before they got rid of my the requirement.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew the dean that was in charge of it, and I went to him and told him my problem, and he wrote a note, says, take this to so-and-so. And so I went from the Ridgeway is always at the end of,
Always.
registration.
Yes.
And so he sent me in, and I got my classes and zoomed back the same day, and then they gave me a deferment. And then in 66, in 64, the engineer that I was working for, who was a World War II vet, and he was still in the reserves, and I think he was like a colonel. And he said, I want you to go get a sample of your work, something that's not secret, and get a copy made and take it, and gave me a phone number, and call this number and get an appointment. I said, what's this for? And he says, well, there's a reserve unit that needs a draftsman. And I said, okay. So I went and showed him my work, and he said, well, sign here. And I said, no, 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 no. wait a second. Um, um, I got school and stuff. And I said, if I can be back by December, then great. And this might have been in March. And so I signed up and he said, you'll be back on December the 12th or 15th or something like that. And so I ended up going to Fort Ord and have a lot of funny stories about that. But it was fun and I made a game out of it, which made it a lot easier than fighting it, and
Yeah.
basic training because they work you to death.
Yes.
And I ended up going to Fort Belvoir, Virginia for my MOS as a topographer, excuse me, and
Mhm.
uh, drawing maps. And hate to say this, I probably never passed a test, but I came out fourth in the class because I just knew what to do,
Yeah.
and so it was kind of fun and on that. And I got out and I was kind of fell in love right before I went in the Army. And I was getting a letter every day and then not so many and then not so many. And I said, if I get a letter today, I'm going to fly home. And if I don't, I'm going to hitchhike home just to see the country. And I got a letter and flew home.
Beautiful. We're
Yeah.
going to take a quick break right here, Mr. Bill, and then we're going to come back and hear how you then, at that point, got into this first class
Okay.
of the paramedics. We'll be right back.
Okay.
This is Michelle. She teaches women how to forgive the people who betrayed them, not by asking them to talk about it, but by helping them express it through art. She's an art therapist and the creator of the art of forgiving, a class that turns emotion into expression. No therapy jargon, no pressure to explain, because forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about setting yourself free. This is Michelle, and this is the art of forgiving.
Oh, this is such a good conversation. I appreciate you sharing from the very, very beginning about being raised by a grandmother, moving so many different times, and yet finding yourself through sports and then moving into college. So tell us then, how did you get into this very first class of paramedics?
Well, I was I was engaged and I was invited to a party and it was on a 3-story and it was on the bay, Alameda Bay in Long Beach and Belmont Shore, Naples Air called. And I was up there looking down, and here goes this guy in a sailboat sailing by. And I said, well, I'm going to get me a job that I can be down there doing that. And I said, well, I'm not going to be a doctor or a lawyer to have enough money. So I started thinking, I said, well, I'm going to be a fireman because they only work 10 days a month.
Mhm.
And so I started doing some research, and I had some neighbors, 2 girls that I lived a block away. They're almost like my sisters, Patty and Joanne. And their brother was a fireman for LA County, and he was a captain. And I called and talked to him about it, what it was like, and da 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 da. And he said, it'd be a good job for you, And so I started going through the process. And I remember and that was my first choice. So I started taking other fire department tests, and I just wasn't passing them. And so I told my Bev, my fiance, uh, I said, let's go to Europe for a year, and we'll get a Volkswagen camper, and we'll camp for a year in Europe. And she said, okay, and then we'll come back and finish college. And so we're all excited about that. And then LA County's test comes up, and I said, well, I'm going there, but I'm going to take the test anyhow. Well, I took, and it was a test like I wrote the test. Instead of asking me things about chemistry and English and math and all this stuff, this was how fast can you look at something and make a decision. And they were like puzzles, or like they show you a picture of a box, and it had all kinds of different shapes, and then it would show you 4 boxes that were one dimension, and you'd have to pick what that would look like all laid out, and you had like 15 seconds to answer or 30 seconds to answer 10 questions. Well, also, I learned that if you have a question test like that, I always go down and hit the bottom three. I'd go A, and then I'd start. So that way I'd answer every one of them.
Right.
And if I got ahead of it, I just erased it and put the right,
Yes.
question. But anyhow, I ended up coming out 80 out of like 3,500. And I went through the training, and I ended up in Battalion 7, which was between Long Beach, California and Torrance, California,
Mm-hmm.
and Watts on the north, or Willowbrook, which was worse than Watts, on the north, and then it wasn't a city then, a area called Carson. And there was a
Yes,
lot of industrial, and we had,
definitely.
yeah. And so um, I eventually ended up at Engine 95 in that area. I was at 127. That's a engine company. And then I ended up at 95. And we squirted water every day there, pretty much. It was, when you're young and dumb, I called it was a great place to be a fireman, because we never trained because we fought fire every day, so it wasn't like we had to go out and practice in a bedroom city.
Right.
And one day in September, the Dr. Criley started this program, the Heart Rescue Unit, and they ended up getting 6 guys from Engine Company 36s because they were like maybe a mile to the hospital, Harbor General, which was a UCLA teaching hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were making fun about it, at the station, how all that blood and all this stuff. Who wants to do that, and then more we talked about it, and more of this process went on. I said, yeah, it does sound kind of interesting. And then about a week later, they sent out a deal that we need 6 more volunteers. And I asked my captain, the more I thought about it, I said, well, I went to college. I should be able to figure this out. And so I asked him if it's okay if I volunteered. And he said yes. And so he told our battalion chief. And so he picked 2 of us. In fact, we were both art majors, believe it or not. He was in painting, I was in design.
Sure.
And so they said on December the 1st, you show up and da-da-da-da. And I did. And when I walked in and looked at all the stuff, I said, what in the world did I do? Because it was like a foreign language. And back then, they didn't have a lot of TV shows
Right.
about hospitals and all emergency rooms and all that stuff. And we just had to learn all the body parts and the bones and the organs. And then we had to learn EKGs and how to read, and then read them. And then after we got through that part, and I remember Carol, we had Big Carol and Little Carol were the 2 main nurses, I think, that trained us. And they, Carol, the Big Carol, she was so funny. She said, yeah, I says it was really hard to figure out what your answer was, because trying to spell these medical words sometimes was a little bit difficult. And so she said, yeah, but I could figure it out what you were trying to do. So all of us passed except one. And he didn't want to be a paramedic in the first place, but he was sort of forced into it. So I think he failed on purpose. But so there was 11 of us. And well, in our class, we had 6 LA City firemen also was in the second class. But we all graduated together. And my partner, Gary, most of the time, he was in the September class. And he had always said, well, I was in the first class. And then I would say, well, I was in the first graduating class.
Yes.
Anyhow, so we had a lot of fun. It was unfortunately, he passed away about 6 months ago. So it was pretty difficult. we shared a lot of tears and a lot of real interesting things that we did. Gary and I were on the very first heart rescue save. The B ship was on the very first save. It was a choking on a rescue, and they finally cleared the airway and be able to resuscitate him. But it their learning was, in a way, they didn't know what to teach us. Because, well, back up a little bit. What was interesting about the program, the upper management saw the vision,
Mm-hmm.
and Dr. Crowley saw the importance of it. But administration of the hospital, nurses, doctors weren't thrilled about it. Lower management, from battalion chiefs, captains, and firemen, didn't like the program because it took too long. And so we were, like I always said, we were like guinea pigs slash, how do I say this? We weren't loved very much, and so it was very uncomfortable going through the process, and a lot of us couldn't wait to get promoted out of there because it was just we worked our butts off, and we had two squads. We had 36s, and then at the hospital we had squad 59.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to pick a nurse up because what was it? Because they discovered there were no laws about administering medication over the airways. And so we had to pick a nurse up. And Harbor Hospital was a World War II hospital.
Right.
And we had a fire station there. And so it was perfect. So we in this fire station, and we just had to go about a couple hundred yards and that poor gals had to run 4 stories down to get to us, then we'd go. But 36s would have a head start, and they would be there the time we got there with a nurse. And so that's how that happened. And then in 72, they passed the Townsend something act, and Governor Reagan. And now he had so much pressure from the Doctors Association and the Nurse Association fighting it not to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But at the very end, he was convinced that it would be a good deal. And so he did sign it. And then once that was signed, we didn't have the nurses. I can tell you some funny stories. I delivered the first baby, and it was in the parking lot of the hospital. We just finished a run, and I'm walking back to the squad, and Gary was in there getting some equipment, and this guy comes running by me, running, yelling, "She's having a baby, she's having a baby," screaming. And so I ran over to where he came from, and I opened the door, and there she was, going through the labor. And I said to myself, I said, God, do I ask her if I can lift her dress up, or
what do you do? Right.
And I said, oh, what the hell? So I just whipped her dress up and pulled her panties down. And then as soon as I did that, it was crowning.
Wow.
And so I delivered it. Now I'm holding it with both hands, and I'm going kind of, and then I grabbed the feet and just let her hang. And then I did this, and then I kind of tickled her in the mouth. And when I did that, she started to cry. And then I picked her up. And by that time, here comes couple of doctors and a gurney and nurses and everybody running out, So I just,
here's the baby. I did the work.
Yeah, and I said, bye.
Well, she did the work as well.
One other quick thing.
Yes.
They didn't train us for this. And so I told Carol, the head nurse, that, we should have sent you guys through that. And she said, well, since you brought it up, you get to go first. And they had a rule up there: you watch one and then you do one. So I went up and watched, and then I did one.
So it sounds like, Mr. Bill, that the original concept was about hearts, about heart attacks, about taking care of the lungs. and that's what you guys were trained in first with the
Right.
EKGs. Um, you had fire trucks already. There were ambulances already. So how did you what vehicles were you guys using as these brand new paramedics?
Well, we had a squad at 36s. If you ever watch the TV show Emergency,
I did.
you'll see the picture of the squad. And then at the hospital, we had I think it was a Dodge station wagon.
Hmm.
And we would pick them up, and the nurse would sit in the back, and we would go. And then we would, most of the time, they would just watch, and sometimes they would get involved, but mostly they would just watch.
And did the station wagon have lights on top and
Oh,
sirens
yeah, yeah,
as
yeah.
well? Okay,
No, yeah, it read and had LA County Fire on it, and it
beautiful.
had Heart Rescue Unit on it. And then I think 70, they were, well, if you're at the hospital, you're learning, you're teaching,
Mhm.
slash training newer paramedics from other cities and from LA County,
Sure.
and public relations. And so at night, a lot of times you would go, we made a makeup rescue film, and then we would go to different cities and have a question answer. We'd show this and then have a question answer with city council members, and they'd ask us, you know, how, all kinds of questions. And then they would vote to have the program. Then
Mhm.
they usually would train them medically, and then they would send them to us, and we would train them in the field. And so,
So the whole group that started were all coming through the fire department.
right.
And it sounds like as you guys began sharing this with other cities and they began listening, it sounds like that they began to take people who were not fire trained, but became
No,
more medically trained.
no, they were all fire trained.
Okay,
Yeah. And the reason is that the stations are designed in a community that you can be to any of them within 5 minutes. And on a heart attack, if you can get to somebody before 5 minutes, there's a high percentage that you can save his life.
sure.
And so that's, excuse me, that's what um, how it was designed. And so the squads grew, and then we got so large that they hired a retired colonel, uh, end up kind of being in charge of it. And then they started writing, rules and regulations. And I mean, we had the run of the hospital. I mean, I actually sutured in the hospital because I asked one day, I said, one of the residents, I said, can you teach me how to suture? And he goes, why in the world do you want to learn how to suture? And I said, well, I go hunting and fishing way into Mexico. And the last time I was there, if I could have sutured, I could have really
Could have been good.
saved, a lot of issues. And he said, well, you practice your knots. And if I like your knots, then I'll let you do one. So I practiced my knots, and he gave me a little test.
Yes.
And then he said, next time I have something, I'll give you a call. And I said, well, I'll probably never hear from him, But sure
Yeah.
enough, about 2 months later, I get this call, and he says, I got one. It's 2 in the morning, and I happened to be on duty. And so I went over there, and this guy just killed, head on collision, just killed two people. He's drunk. And he had about an 18-inch cut up his leg. And I didn't realize how much the skin shrinks. And I said, well, there's no skin there,
Yeah.
because it was about an inch and a half, spread
Yeah.
open.
Mhm.
And he laughed, and he said, oh. And I said, well, you start it. And so he put in two sutures, and then I finished it. And he said, that's really good. You did a good job. Oh, and then he said, don't worry about making it pretty, because where he's going, it's not going to matter. So, you know, you have to have that kind of attitude or you go crazy.
Yeah.
And so every once in a while, I'd come back on a run, and he'd see me. He says, you got a second? I said, yeah, what do you need? And he says, well, go to room 3 and put in 3 sutures in the back of his head. And so
Right.
I did 3 or 4 of those. And then one day I'm doing the one, and I felt someone was watching me, but I didn't. I just kept doing what I was prepping. And And it was the head nurse, and the nurses complained and they were, I don't not say jealous, but we could do stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They had 4 years of college, and we, do all kinds of things that they couldn't do.
Yeah.
And that was, frustrating for them. But I actually sewed up one of the fire captain's eyebrow, put in 7 stitches there. We were at Mammoth, had a police fireman winter Olympics, and he did a head plant on an inner tube race, and I sewed his eye up right there And, but anyhow, that's that story. But all of us, and we didn't have equipment. See, there was no equipment, and we had to build a radio. That's what the first group did, and then like we had to carry in this box that was the O2 system. Well, then I said, this thing's heavy. You got to get 2 guys. The fireman had to hold the bottle, and it was glass at the time.
Right.
And so I went in the hospital, and they had O2s were on carts. And I kind of measured it, went out and measured the squad to make sure it would fit in. And so I just borrowed it, and then I went over to one of the beds and borrowed a adjustable IV holder, and I welded it onto the cart. And so that eliminated 2 firemen, one carrying something in and one holding the bottle.
Right.
And so all of us, some guys built boxes and just different things to store. And in the beginning, we had to mix medication, and they gave us an old leather doctor bag with all the medication in. And some of it we had to saw and tap, and it was the pits. And so one of the nurses was shopping and saw a fishing tackle box. And it was a little small one.
Yes.
And we looked at it and took it back. Great idea. We took it back and got the big one. And
yes.
We're famous for having the tackle box worldwide. Everybody uses the tackle box to hold the medication in. And so,
yes.
But it was, and we always, at least I believe, every day was a new day because it was so, we just weren't liked. And especially if you go into a privately owned hospital, boy, and some firemen, they had another program that was at a Daniel Freeman, I think it was, and it was sort of a private hospital. And the guys that went through that training hated it. After every rescue, they were drilled over and over about, you didn't do this protocol correctly or that. And we had no standing orders. And then I think about 71, we finally said, give us standing orders on a full arrest, because we do the same thing every time.
Every time. Yeah.
And a lot of us would start an IV before we were told we could, because we knew we needed an IV, and it would save us a ton of time going through step 1, step 2, step 3. And you had to give these certain medications so many seconds or minutes apart, because if you mix 2 of them together, it turns into chalk.
Yeah.
And so you had to be really careful on timing and that kind of stuff. But it was a learning curve every day. And I mean, I would do it all over again. I mean, I delivered 10 babies, and I can tell you that bringing life into this world is quite a rush, and bringing someone back into this world is even a bigger rush. And I was been fortunate to do both. And so again, all of us, and would do it again. I got promoted in, what was it, 67, I think, to engineer. And, you drive the fire truck and get to squirt water.
Yeah.
And then I got promoted to captain in 67, I think it was. And then I got hurt in 1980, and that was my last day as a fireman. I ran through fire to cut it off, and I ran into a post, and I popped 2 discs in my neck. I already had 2 discs in my lower back that were shot, and then I fell through a roof and got a bum knee. So they added all that up and says, you're done.
So you help out now with it's not a library. People aren't coming to that, but they're coming to the museum.
Right.
So you were helping out the museum and you were helping to do tours and those kinds of things. What is the museum specifically for?
It's the LA County Fire Museum. We have a fire apparatus that goes back to 1855,
Wow.
and it goes through all the different fire trucks over the century that we've had. And the LA County is a 100-year-old fire department as of last year. I think it was 2024, yeah,
Yeah.
or 23, somewhere in there. So we're 100 years old. And so we have a lot of history. We have a history of our helmets. They go from tin to fiberglass to plastic and a newer plastic and a newer shape. Um, and we have both fire trucks. We have the squad and the ambulance, and all of the uniforms and equipment from the show are there. And the people come. I mean, I'm just amazed what the people come there from. I mean, I've done Tokyo. The last one I did was Poland,
Mm.
and they Australia, New Zealand. I mean, you kind of name it, that they come there. And I've done like 3 from Australia, and all over the United States.
Yes,
And a
definitely.
lot of them will come in and says, I was 8 years old and I'm watching an emergency, and I told my mommy I'm going to be a paramedic when
Yeah.
I grow up. And he's just retired, and he was a paramedic, And also, back to that, I was a technical advisor on the show,
Mm.
and that was real interesting. And also I was on the scene on the very first show that they made. That's the what do you call it, the
The
introductory
pilot?
show.
The
Yeah, the
pilot?
pilot.
Hmm.
And we had a 4 alarm fire at this building, so it was all burned down practically. It's a big brick thing, and but they set a fire again, and because I was at Engine 95 there, and so we got to be there to watch them, and we were there in case it started bigger, and so we were
Right.
there to put it out. But and so we, I mean, the show. Um, what was funny or interesting about it, when you're a technical advisor, Gary, because we go by seniority. You're
Right.
one, two, three. When you're 10, you're kind of always at the end. And so my show was farther down the road. But when Gary did his, the director, Gary went up and said, well, we don't do it that way. And he says, I know what I'm doing, and just walked off. And Gary goes, well, why am I here? And so he tried again, and the director saw him coming, and he walks off. And so Gary goes to Senator, who's the producer, and he says, well, I got, a kind of a problem. This guy doesn't want to talk to me. And he says, I don't know what, to do. And he said, oh, don't worry about it. He said, directors are dime a dozen. He says, take care of it, Gary. So Gary goes back. So, okay, one more time. So Gary walks back, and he's corners the director, and he says, Bob and I, and before Gary could say the next word, he said, Gary, you're absolutely correct. Because he mentions Bob's name, you know. And so I learned from that. So when I showed up, I went up and introduced myself to the director, and they give us a little red tag, a nameplate that says "for real" on it, because you have your badge and you look like an actor, with others
Right.
on set, and so you
Right.
wore the red tag that says "for real," and then you had a little chair that says, you're the guy there, so technical advisor. So I went to him and said, I don't care what you do. I said, I don't don't embarrass me, don't embarrass the fire department, and don't embarrass yourself. If you're not positively sure of a scene,
Yeah.
come and talk to me before you shoot. So it would be, no problem. And he talked to me twice. And on one scene, I said, well, we don't do a hose lay that way. And he said, all you'll see is it flopping out of the back of the truck. And so gave him a thumbs up, and so it went really, really, smooth. But
And
it's really fun to go through the steps of how they make movies and stuff. It's pretty entertaining.
were you pleased with the end result then when you saw Emergency and you saw your particular episode where you'd been the technical director?
Yeah, no, it was good.
Good.
We had one scene at night, and it was really, really cold, and I guess I asked something about that. Oh, so I says, can my wife come and watch? And they, oh, sure. I said, but she can't. She's pregnant, but someone has to bring her. So that's no problem. Have them come. And so a friend of mine drove her, and his wife came up and got to watch. The scene was they're burning a lab blew up and they're on fire, and the guy comes running out on fire, which was scary because I was about ready to get involved. It got that close of it's taking too long to put the flames out.
Yeah. Yes.
But it was really cold, and it was exciting. And I said, well, how come you're having this at night? He says, well, it's real simple. If we had it during the day, and the smog people, I can't remember what their title was, air something.
Air quality,
Yeah, air quality. And he said it would be like a $10,000 fine for putting the smoke in the air. But at night, they can't see it. And if they can't see it, they can't fine you. So that was the secret of. So when you see a movie at night with a lot of flames and smoke, that's the reason. And then one of the actors came up and he was talking to me, and he said, man, it's really cold. And so I told my wife, I said, why don't you bring me my flask with a little bit of Yukon Jack in it? Because I knew it was going to be till 2 a.m.
Right.
And so I'm all bundled up, and he's talking about how cold it was. And I just kind of pulled it out and undid it and handed the flask to him. And he took a swig and said, oh, this is really good. And so, yeah, I says, it keeps you warm. And so he goes off back, and then he comes back about 20 minutes later and says, damn, it's cold. That's that story. But and it was fun. At least I thought I was relaxed and they were relaxed, and it was a lot of fun. The actors, I think, were a little star driven at that early age because we were the show was against the number one show, All in the Family, and we were a fill-in. And so they didn't know if it wasn't going to make it.
Right.
But very quickly it became the number one show. Yeah. And they didn't want to buy a fire truck because until they knew the show was going to be a success, because you're talking close to $1 million.
Yeah.
To buy a fire truck. And so they borrowed one from it. Universal Studios had LA County Fire Station on their campus.
Right.
Engine 60. So they would just drive Engine 60 up, and they had a magnetic 51 decal that fit right over
60.
That, and we would film it. And back in my day, we had convertible fire trucks, and they were great, but also you lose your hearing too. It's cold, and when it rained, it's really cold. And, but it was, it was really fun, and it was educational. And the prop guy liked me, and
that's always a plus.
It's a plus. And so when I was leaving, he said, I have a present for you. He came out and gave me a fetoscope. He said, we have 2 of them, and he says, they can take turns sharing it. He said both of them having one. So he gave me that, and I got to listen to my babies when I was home, their heartbeat every night. So that was really kind of enjoyable. So
that is.
But I have a lot of stories. I cooked, had a cookie, like this. They had a cooking scene. And I said, well, how do you just, does that stove really work? He said, oh, yeah. I said, well, I'll cook you lunch. And he said, well, I said, what's your favorite meal? And he said, and can't remember what it was. It's not enchiladas or something like no. What's when you bread with old age? Anyhow, well, yeah, I cooked lunch for everybody. I gave him a menu, and he went and got all the food I cooked. And he said, make sure you leave enough in the pot that the captain can stir it.
Yes, yes,
And
there
so
needs
I
to be,
made this
yes.
great
Yeah.
chili relleno is what I made.
Beautiful, beautiful. Mr. Bill, you have a book that you're working on. Tell us about your book.
Well, from all these tours I've done over the last, 3 years, I think, or close to 3 years, everybody says you should write a book, and having a learning disability, spelling and all that is not my forte. And so one day I just said, you know what, I'm going to write a book. And then I went to Best Buy and asked them, I said, how do you get my laptop here to where I can talk to it and where we'll write. And
Right.
the guy took him about 10 seconds, and I just push a little button and start talking. And then I would call some of my buddies and say, well, write something up. And they always say, I'm going to do it, but only out of about 10 I called, only three have.
Mm-hmm.
But we got everybody together, even the two that were only five of us left, plus two LA City guys that are left. And we got there at the museum at 9 until 2 and
Good,
just told stories, and we videoed it and
good,
recorded everybody's stories. And we're in the process. I am reading these things and telling who's who on this.
good.
And so we did that, and I'm got a ghostwriter,
Mhm.
and we are just starting to kind of put it together. And I've written
Do you
about
have a title? Do you have a title yet for your book?
no, that's the thing, there's trying to come up with a title that works and
That's catchy, that's gonna be sustainable,
yeah.
go for a long time, that
Well, she thinks it, and I think too, just from all the people that come in that keep saying they have these websites from the show that have 80,000 members, and there's three or four websites, and so, but it's funny, and we tell a lot of the pranks, and um, I can tell you one of the pranks if you want to hear, but it's
we have time for one, yes, do tell us.
well the nurse a patient passes away, and they have to move it out of the CC cardiac care unit into a room, and they ask us to watch it,
Mhm.
watch the person, and then the nurses goes back to do some paperwork, so we move the patient to another room, and then Gary gets on the gurney. We put the sheet over him, and so the nurse comes back and rolling down the hallway to had a special elevator, and about almost there, he reaches out and grabs her hand or her wrist, and she about peed her pants, I think. And so it was, and so the poor nurses, we were always doing stuff,
Yeah.
things, they were, but they were heartbroken when they couldn't write anymore. They really enjoyed going on the rescues with us. And I realized after all the stress, when I got promoted to engineer, my wife said, you've changed. And I said, what do you mean I've changed? I'm still me. And she goes, no, no, you've changed. And I didn't realize how much stress it was, going through all the pressures from everybody. And the biggest pressure was you didn't want to screw up, and you didn't want to fail the program because you saw how great it would be for the public.
Yes.
And so all of us, I think, worked harder on stuff.
Mhm.
And so we did the pranks to, I guess, to lead the stress. And we always joked that, today, if we did what we did then, we'd be fired on the spot or put in jail for whatever. But at the time, it was pretty funny.
Mr. Bill, I have loved this conversation with you. I so appreciate that you are somebody who has the ability to look back at your full life and all the different pieces there, and that you're able to come to this point and say, there's still so much more gas in the tank. There are more people to help. There are more encouragement to give. What's the one takeaway that you would like for our listeners to hold on to walk away from this conversation with?
Well, I'll be 84 in December,
Mm.
and I learned to stay active, eat half a meal, and I I learned at a young age to take. Johnny Johnson gave me the best advice ever. He told me I should start a business, and I said I can't spell, and he he was a big guy. And he kind of pulled me over, and I was friends of his oldest son, and he leans down and looks at, and says, "Do you know why God invented secretaries? They can spell." He says, "Surround yourself with smart people, point them in the direction you want to go." So I ended up starting an architectural business that I wasn't licensed. I ended up doing over 2,000 projects in the Long Beach. I did home in Colorado and um, Catalina and Arizona. But I got really good at it. I had one drafting class in architecture in high school, and I ended up doing apartment buildings, restaurants, $1 million homes, and the other thing about life is that you just people tend to, by taking no, can't, and maybe out of your vocabulary, it allows you to go forward. And if you fail on the first thing, you just keep going and you zigzag through until you succeed. And for every problem I had, I got outside the box and I solved the solution. And I got really good at solving issues. And I mean, um, and I do that through life. Most of the things I've done early in my life was due to necessity. In other words, I couldn't afford to hire an architect,
Mhm.
so I became one.
Right.
My first house, I became a plumber,
Mhm.
electrician, a drywaller, set tile, did floor, the tile floor and tile counters. I installed the cabinets. I learned how to do it, and I got good at it. And so you just have to focus. Then I got into flipping houses. Then I got into apartment buildings, and I'll give you one great example. I retired to Prescott, Arizona, and I learned to always look in the WANAs and see what's going on. And I found this house, I know this office building, it was going to be auctioned off on Tuesday, and this was Friday. And it sounded really interesting. So I drove over and looked at it, and it was a Class A building with three buildings. And I said, man, that's really neat. And they wanted, I think, well, first I called the bank, and it was my bank. And so I talked to one of the vice presidents, and I said, well, it told me all about it. And I said, and had a second. So I said, could you get me the name of the first and the second? And the first guy was in bankruptcy, and the second was like 250,000. So he gave me the phone numbers. I called the first guy, and I said, if I get you out of bankruptcy, will you sign all the documents? And I said, I'll buy you a dinner. He said, yes, I'll do that. So I called the lady that had, or the couple that had the second. I said, I'll give you $10,000 for your second. She said, wait, but it's a $250,000. And I said, yeah, but on Tuesday, you're going to lose it all. And she said, I want 25,000. And I said, well, I'm not a greedy person. I'll split the difference. And so I gave her 12.5, called the bank back, and I says, I, I have control of the second, and what's his name is going to sign all the documents. And I said, would you take 425 for it? And he said, we can do that. I said, as is. And he said, done deal. So on Tuesday, when it was supposed to go to auction, I owned the building.
Oh, that's such
And And
Great,
so,
great story.
and so that's how you, when they say no, I don't have a no in my vocabulary. So I walked around the box outside and figured out how to solve all the issues at hand. And so that's what people have to do when you want something. You take away, you don't let your, I learned that my learning disabilities, I, I don't pay any attention to them because I outthink it in a
Yeah.
sense. And so, and
We are.
that's what I try to tell my grandkids and
Mhm.
everybody when I do, talk to people. Like there was a kid, he was 16 and he wanted to be a fireman. And I, and he, and, and I told him his wife was, not wife, his mother was there. And I told him, I said, it's great to have dreams, but sometimes for certain reasons, those dreams don't come true. And you can't let it get you down. And I said, like, you might go in there and be colorblind and not know it, and you couldn't be a fireman, at least in my day, if you were colorblind. Or you might have a physical issue that you can't be because you can't pass, the physical. And so you always want to have plan B. And so if you go to college, at least learn or a trade school and learn a trade, if something goes wrong or down the bumpy road of life, you'll have a choice
Mhm.
versus, not. And she must have thanked me 20 times to giving him this little talk.
Yeah.
But that's what and I kind of believe like playing it forward. I've started 4 or 5 charitable trusts, for education, especially in my wife's name. And
Yes.
so I'm doing that now in my life, and I want to travel, and I well, I still do stuff. I got 20 something acres in Central California that I'm subdividing, and so I stay busy that way, and I travel, and I have a workshop. I turn bowls and do artwork,
Wow.
and my wife used to say, if I'm not bleeding, I'm not having much fun. So,
Mr. Bill, we have loved this conversation with you sharing these incredible nuggets. Thank you so much. And we look forward to future conversations with you and for your book coming out. Thank you so much.
well, I'm doing 2 books, so I'm doing
Well,
about my whole life from start to finish here, and one about the paramedics and how it all happened and what we went through. So,
we will be looking forward to both of those. And to our audience, we say thank you so much for being here, for listening to the end, and knowing that we want you to take really good care of you and just to hold on to these nuggets about never giving up, taking the word no out of your vocabulary. You are absolutely worth it.